his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest too that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them in pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces, and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odours unto him. The king answered unto Daniel, and said, Of a truth it is, that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, the chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Brad, for that reading, and Luke. And thanks for the team out the back who sound like they've fixed the mic. Awesome. So tonight is the first in a series of 3 nights looking at prophecy. And tonight, as has been mentioned already, and you've got on the screen, we're going to look at Daniel chapter 2, known as Nebuchadnezzar's image. So in a week's time, we've then got another night on Ezekiel 38, which you might describe as the prophecy of Armageddon. And finally, in a fortnight's time, we have the prophecy in Luke chapter 21, which is about the return of Jesus Christ. And so over these 3 nights, what we really want to try and do is, firstly, we want to display the accuracy of Bible prophecy, and we want to consider how that accuracy can build our faith, and we want to consider some unfulfilled prophecies that could impact our life. And we'll cover off number 1 and be touching on number 2 as well tonight, and then the third one will be covered off definitely in the next couple of nights. So let's get started. And to get started, what we want to just do briefly is just refresh our memory on what prophecy is and why we have prophecy in the Bible. So what is prophecy? So prophecy is God saying what is going to happen in the future. It's as simple as that. But there's two things to note about this. The first one is that Bible prophecy is not a prediction. It's not a guess. It is an actual true account of what is going to happen in the future. And that's amazing, isn't it? Because as humans, we cannot tell what is going to happen in the future, can we? No human can tell the future. We cannot even be certain that we're going to wake up with our alarm the next day. I don't know how many times you've slept through your alarm, but I do it plentiful times, unfortunately. As humans, though, the closest thing we can maybe predict is the weather. But to forecast the weather, we actually have to take thousands of observations and then process that through a supercomputer. And even with that, we can only really do it accurately for a few days. And this sort of links into it does link into the second aspect of our definition to note, and that is that Bible prophecy is prophecy from God. It has been written by people, but these people were inspired by God. And this obviously explains why it's accurate. Prophecy in the Bible is accurate because it is from God. God is telling us, mortals, his plans of the future. And we've just got 3 verses to display this. 2 Peter 1, verse 21. For prophecy never had its origin in the human will, but prophets, though human, spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. Isaiah 42, verse 9. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them, is what God says. Isaiah 46, verse 10, again God speaking, I declare the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. So God speaks through his prophets, and they have recorded God's word in the Bible that we have today. So that brings the next question, why has God given us Bible prophecy? And there are really 2 reasons. I'm sure there's many more, but maybe it comes down to 2. The first one is that God has given us prophecies that are fulfilled to help build our faith. And our prophecy tonight, for the most part, is a great example of this because most of it is fulfilled. And the second reason is displayed in Revelation 1, verse 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. The book of Revelation is a prophecy, and God is saying he has given us prophecy so we can see and understand the events that are to come. We know God's purpose is to fill the earth, and we can see this from verses like Numbers 14:21. But prophecy actually gives us more detail about how this is actually going to happen. And one last thing to note about this, as the saying goes, with knowledge comes responsibility. And this is exactly the same with Bible prophecy. And Jesus actually warns us of this in Mark 13, verse 23. But be on guard, I have told you all things beforehand. So with knowledge of prophecy, we also have a certain amount of responsibility to react to that and respond to that. So with that as a bit of a background, let's get into Daniel chapter 2. So the man Daniel, he lived in the kingdom of Judah in the 6th century BC. And as a young man, he was taken captive from Jerusalem when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon invaded. And Babylon during this period of time, it was an old nation that was regaining power. Babylon, as a name of a place, had been around for 1,500 years already. The earliest mention was on a clay tablet in roughly 2200 BC. And when we enter the story of Babylon here, Babylon is growing in influence and power. It had just spent the last 300 years being dominated or controlled by Assyria. However, Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, Nabopolassar, had recently been on a 17-year campaign destroying the Assyrian army, setting up Babylon as a great power in the region. So during this period of time, it was said to be the first city to reach a population of 200,000 people, and it's believed to have covered an area of about 22 kilometres squared, which is about twice the size of Adelaide CBD. It's also believed that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were built during this period. So Babylon, it was a modern city for its time. And so as we enter the life of Daniel, we can see Babylon extending its influence by attacking the kingdom of Judah. And we can see this from chapter 1, verse 1, that says, "The invasion occurred in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah." So King Jehoiakim, he reigned from about 608 to 597 BC. So the 3rd year of his reign is 605 BC. And at this point in time in history, the northern kingdom of Israel had already been destroyed for over a century by Assyria. And by this time in 605, by the time 605 comes along, Babylon had destroyed Assyria and was now destroying Judah. And we do not know exactly how old Daniel was when he was taken into Babylon in 605. However, we know that Nebuchadnezzar asked for children, or as other translations put it, young men who had no blemish. So this meant that they were healthy and strong, good-looking, trained in wisdom, having a good education and much knowledge and understanding in science. So Nebuchadnezzar essentially wanted smart young men that he could educate and then give them jobs in his house. And these qualities show that Daniel must have been in his teens, opposed to a child. So Daniel, maybe roughly around 18, was taken from Judah as a captive. And we don't know anything about his family, however, we do know he had 3 friends that were taken into Babylon with him, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Despite being captives, though, Daniel wasn't actually a slave. And God blessed these 4 young men in verse 17 of chapter 1. It says, "God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had the understanding in visions and dreams." So God blessed them so much that Nebuchadnezzar found these 4 young men 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers in his kingdom. And so Nebuchadnezzar made the 4 friends wise men in Babylon. And we can see the way that God is working with these 4 young men, especially with Daniel and his ability that he has through God's power to understand visions and dreams. So as we come into chapter 2, we find Nebuchadnezzar is in the 2nd year of his reign, and he's troubled about a dream which he had. So he calls in the magicians and enchanters, sorcerers and Chaldeans, and this group of people, it appears that there may be a subset of the wise men because Daniel wasn't actually there at that point of time. And so this group comes before the distressed king, standing there. The king asks them to tell the dream first, then the interpretation. The king obviously asks this to check if the magicians can actually tell him the dream. And the magicians, they know that they can't do this, and they tell the king truthfully that no man on earth can. And with this, the king is furious, and he's in such a rage that he wants all the wise men of Babylon killed. And this includes Daniel. Daniel hears of these orders and arranges an appointment with the king to show him the interpretation. Before this appointment takes place, though, take note of what Daniel does in verse 17 and 18. It reads, "Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon." So these 4 young men, they sought God's help, his mercy, for they knew that they themselves could not tell the king his dream, because no man can do that. Only God can tell them the dream and the interpretation. And we can see that God helps them, doesn't he? In verse 19, "Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven." So with the interpretation given to Daniel, he goes to the king and says, "No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked." And these are the same words that the Chaldeans had said earlier, aren't they, back in verse 10. But Daniel goes on to say, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days." And this is the real point of it, isn't it? There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. It is God in heaven who gives us prophecy about what will happen in the latter days. And with that, Daniel explains the dream. King Nebuchadnezzar's dream was of this big, tall, bright statue, but the statue was strange in the fact that it was made from 5 different materials. The head was made of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the thighs of bronze, the legs of iron, and the feet a mix of iron and clay. And these 5 different materials become crucial to the interpretation of the dream and the power of this prophecy. The last part of the dream is the stone that goes towards the image and smashes it in the base, right into the feet of iron and clay, and this whole image comes crashing down to the ground. And then lastly, the rock grows up into a big mountain. It's quite a full-on dream, isn't it? I'm not sure if you've had any dreams like it. Obviously, it created a lot of stress for Nebuchadnezzar. And so the big question is, what is the interpretation? Well, we're really blessed in this chapter because the interpretation is right here from verse 37 to 45. So Daniel says that King Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold, and then after him another kingdom inferior to you shall arise up, and then a third of bronze, which shall rule over the earth, and there shall be a fourth of iron. And then Daniel says that there will be the feet and toes, I should say, partly of clay and partly of iron. And Daniel says it shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with clay. And then speaking about the stone at the end, Daniel says, "And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed." It's an amazing interpretation, isn't it? God, through Daniel, is able to tell Nebuchadnezzar, firstly the dream, but then also the interpretation. After Babylon, there'll become another kingdom and another one, 5 in total, before the statue is smashed to the ground by the stone. And you can imagine how Nebuchadnezzar must have felt, being told that Babylon is going to fall. Nebuchadnezzar is obviously overwhelmed by Daniel's words as he falls on his face and worships Daniel. So with that as background, living in the year 2024, this prophecy becomes even more amazing when we have a look at history to see how it all lines up. So what we want to do is really take some time to unpack the nations that are mentioned and to show that God knew of events that would happen hundreds of years in the future. So the first nation is the head of gold, and we know directly from what Daniel said that this head of gold represents the Babylonian Empire. Despite being told this, though, I think it's a good exercise and a good question to ask, why gold? Why did God choose gold to represent the Babylonian Empire? So gold, it's obviously the finest of all metals, isn't it? And that is exactly what Babylon was. It was the finest of all cities. The National Geographic even has an article titled "Beautiful Babylon, Jewel of the Ancient World." And it's right, isn't it? Babylon, the city standing between 2 rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, was, as the National Geographic article again puts it, it says it was seen as a prize for the taking. It was the city that every nation wanted to take, and it consequently was ransacked multiple times. However, it endured on. And this period of time in Daniel chapters 1 to 5 is known as the Neo-Babylonian period. And the author of the National Geographic article, again, he calls it Babylon's Golden Age. As mentioned earlier, it was the largest city of its time. It had this grand processional way paved with limestone. It had renovated temples. It had the Ishtar Gate. made of glazed cobalt blue bricks with bulls and dragons. Babylonian citizens saw their city as paradise. However, gold, like riches, has its dark side, doesn't it? It obviously represents wealth, but it can also enchant. It can bewitch you with its beauty. And this is how God sees Babylon, described for us in Jeremiah 51. This chapter is all about God's judgments against Babylon. And we have down in verse 7 God speaking, and he says, "Babylon has been a golden cup in the hand of the Lord." So again, you can see gold being used as the symbol of Babylon. But reading on, it says, "A golden cup in the hand of the Lord, which has made all the earth drunk. The nations have drunk of her wine, therefore the nations are mad." And Babylon's riches, Babylon's wealth, its status as a jewel of all cities, this golden cup had poured out its wine on the nations, making them all drunk. And coming back to Daniel, we can see in chapter 3 that Nebuchadnezzar was indeed enchanted by gold, as he goes ahead in chapter 3 and makes a massive golden image, 40 cubits high, which is about 27 metres, which is 2/3 the height of the Statue of Liberty. It was a very tall structure for its day. And just to hammer home the point about Babylon and gold, it's very fitting that the word gold, depending on the translation that you are using, appears 15 times in the book of Daniel. And 11 of these are within the first 5 chapters, which are focused on the Babylonian Empire. And 6 of these 11 times are in chapter 5, which records the dying moments of the kingdom of Babylon. So the dying moments, it records how King Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son, was drunk from wine. And while drunk, he ordered the golden vessels that his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem to be brought to him, so that he and the guests of his party may drink from them while praising the gods of gold and silver. How blasphemous is that? How proud is that? How drunk with riches? We don't have time to look at it in detail, but as a result of his pride, Babylon is destroyed that very night by the Medo-Persian Empire. And we have the record over in Daniel 5, verse 30 to 31, and it reads, "That very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans," which is another name for the Babylonian Empire, "was put to death, and Darius the Mede took the kingdom, being about 62 years old." And so this brings us to the chest and arms of silver. And as we just read, we are told by Daniel that the Medo-Persian Empire overthrew Babylon. And therefore we can easily conclude that the Medo-Persians are the chest and arms of silver. So something interesting that I found, for those that know their ancient history, know that the invasion of Babylon occurred in 539 BC by Cyrus the Great. And this may make you wonder why the record then says Darius the Mede took Babylon instead of saying Cyrus the Persian. And it's a good thing to wonder because, after all, if the prophecy doesn't line up with history, then how can we tell you that it is accurate? So what we want to do, just for the next few moments, is to provide 5 pieces of evidence that show that this Darius is indeed Cyrus, but also show that calling him Darius the Mede is actually still accurate. So we'll just run through these 5 pieces of evidence. So the first piece of evidence is that Daniel says that Darius was 62 when he took the kingdom. And from history we know that Cyrus was born in 600 BC, which would, as the record notes, make him 61, 62, and 539 BC when he becomes the king of Babylon. So that's point number 1. Number 2, in Daniel 5 verse 31, he's called the Mede. And there's a number of reasons why he is described this way. So firstly, when Cyrus became king of Persia before they invaded Babylon, it was actually a vassal state of Media. Cyrus, like his predecessors, had to recognise Astyages, who was the last king of the Median Empire, as the actual ruler. And so Cyrus was therefore just a vassal king at the beginning of his reign. The second point is that Cyrus's father was a Persian named Cambyses. However, his mother was Maindine, a daughter of Astyages, who was king of Media. So Cyrus was actually in the royal line of the Median Empire, albeit through marriage. The third thing to note is that Cyrus in 550 BC did actually end up rebelling against the Median Empire and conquering it. He captured his grandfather Astyages and he spared his life. And so in the end, he did actually become the king of the territory of the Median Empire. And then the third thing to note is that Herodotus in his book, Histories Book 1, actually calls Cyrus king of the Medes. So he obviously had that reputation as well. So the third piece of evidence, just to show, is that if we look up the word Darius in the Strong's Dictionary, we see it is of Persian origin and it's a title of Persian kings rather than an actual name. And this is just like the word Pharaoh for Egyptian kings. The fourth one to note is that this then fact about it just being a title comes out when you look at Daniel 11 verse 1. In the King James Version it reads, "Also I in the first year of Darius the Mede." However, in the Septuagint and Theodotion translation, the translators have put "also I in the first year of Cyrus the Mede." So again, you can see some people use the title and some use the name. And then last thing, just to note, in Daniel 6 verse 28, I found this quite interesting. When reading this verse, you might actually think it's evidence against our argument because it reads, "So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian." So when reading this, it makes it sound like Daniel is saying there are two people, Darius and Cyrus. However, what Daniel was really saying is, in the reign of Darius, that is to say, the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And you may wonder why we can sort of suggest this is the right way to translate it. And the reason we can suggest this is because it's done the same way in many other verses. So we've got a few examples on the board there on the screen. Daniel 1 verse 3 is the first. "So the king instructs Ashpenaz to bring back children of Israel and the king's seed and of the princes." The king's seed, they are the princes, aren't they? To be the son of the king is by definition to be a prince. And so this should really be translated, "and of the king's seed," that is to say, the princes. They're one and the same thing. Again, in Daniel 6 verse 9, it's another example. "Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree." The decree is the writing. There are not two documents, but they are actually one and the same. And so therefore we can translate it, "Wherefore King Darius signed the writing," that is to say, the decree. And then Daniel 7 verse 1 is the last example. And it says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had dreams and visions of his head upon his bed." And like the previous examples, dreams are visions, aren't they? They are one and the same thing. And so it can be translated, "Daniel had dreams," that is to say, visions of his head. And so these 5 pieces of evidence show that Daniel wasn't incorrect in saying Darius the Mede, as this phrase means ruler of the Mede, the Median Empire, which was indeed Cyrus. And so I think it's important just to run through that because that shows that actually Daniel was still being accurate in what he was saying. And so the chest and arms of silver represent the Medo-Persian Empire. And in our prophecy, this is characterised in 2 ways. It's firstly represented by the metal silver, and it's also recorded as being inferior. So let's just have a look at how these 2 characteristics come out in the Medo-Persian Empire. So firstly, silver. Why would God use silver to represent the Medo-Persian Empire? And I suggest that God used silver because the power and the wealth of the Medo-Persian Empire has its roots in their extensive tax system. And I'll just display this. So Darius the First, or Darius the Great, was the fourth king of the Medo-Persian Empire. He ruled from 522 to 486 BC, and he reformed the tax system in 519 BC. And Herodotus, in his third book, in chapter 89, described how he divided his dominions into 20 governments, called by the Persians strapes. And doing so, and appointing governors, he ordained that each several nation should pay him tribute. In the reigns of Cyrus and Cambyses after him, there were no fixed tribute, but payment was made in gifts. It is by reason of this fixing of the tribute and other ordinances that the Persians called Darius the huckster, Cambyses the master, and Cyrus the father. For Darius made a petty profit out of everything. Huckster, however you say it, it means a salesman or a haggler, and you get the sense of why he was called this when you read about how he worked out the tax amounts. Herodotus, again in his sixth book in chapter 42, described how the land was precisely measured and classified according to the crops cultivated and the size of the harvest, and it was based on this that the taxes were then paid. And there are records preserved from this time that state the number of fruit trees even, and the kind of crops and the extent of farmable land. And Darius was so precise, he measured and categorized everything to ensure that his tax was paid. And everyone was to pay these taxes, and they were to be paid in silver, except, for whatever reason, the province of India, which was allowed to pay in gold. And so, with this silver taxation system in place, the wealth of the empire grew. And it's actually estimated that 1.5 billion coins were kept in the treasury as a reserve. And so it begs the next question: how does the description of being inferior to Babylon fit to this empire? After all, it had more riches than Babylon. It ruled a greater area than Babylon. It had a greater military strength than Babylon. So in what way was it inferior? And while you could argue that the Medo-Persians were inferior as they were a kingdom struggling with internal unity, I suggest that the real meaning of Scripture here is understood after considering the Chaldean word inferior. And you see, because this word appears 21 times in the Bible, and 19 of these are in Daniel, and in all 21 verses it's translated as earth, except in this one. So the Strong's defines it as corresponding to the earth, by implication lowly or earthly. And I think with this knowledge we can learn that Daniel maybe isn't really saying that the Medo-Persians were inferior, but instead he was maybe saying that they were a more earthly kingdom. And we've already displayed that the Medo-Persians loved their wealth and riches, and it brings to mind verses like 1 Timothy 6 verse 10, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." And so for the Medo-Persians, just as riches turn to dust and fade away, so did the Medo-Persian Empire as the century turned, revolts occurred. And the Persians battled the Greeks for 20-odd years until the Persian army took a significant defeat in 479 BC on the slopes of Mount Mikhail in Ionia, which is the central western coast of modern-day Turkey. And so the Greek Empire grew and the Persian Empire slowly faded away. And this then really brings us to the belly and thighs of brass, the Greek Empire. But before we go any further, I think it's really important for us just to remind ourselves something. Daniel was roughly 18 in 605 BC, and we do not know when he died, but let's presume he lived until he was 90 years old. And if this is the case, then he would have died in 533 BC. But we're now here in 479 BC, 54 years later. When Daniel wrote this book, there was no way that he could have predicted what would have happened 54 years later. Can a human predict what would happen in 54 years' time? Absolutely not. And one thing that I find quite interesting is that during the 6th century BC, when Daniel was living, there wasn't even really a Greek empire. During these 100 years from 601 to 500 BC, the Greek cities were only just starting to establish a formal partnership with each other. They were no powerhouse like the Persians. There was no way that Daniel, as a human, would have ever been able to think that they would be the next ruling power after the Persians. And indeed, on top of this, it wasn't really until the League of Corinth was established in 338 BC, roughly 195 years after Daniel's death, that Greece really became a powerful force. This league was established by Philip II of Macedon, unifying the Greek military forces under one command. And Alexander the Great, his son, then used this force over the next 30 years to destroy the Medo-Persians and expand Greece into an empire stretching from Greece all the way to India. So over 195 years later, after Daniel lived, over 195 years after the prophecy was written, we have this amazing fulfillment of prophecy. The Greeks overthrowing the Medo-Persian Empire to become the next ruling power of the area. And this prophecy is only possible because it is a prophecy from God, who knows the beginning from the end. So coming back to the prophecy then, again, let's ask the question, why did God use bronze to represent the Greeks? Well, I believe he used bronze to represent the Greeks because the Greek army, they were decked in bronze. The staple of the Greek army was the hoplite. They were armed with long spears, sometimes up to 21 feet long. And they had big round shields that were 1 metre wide, and they had a sword. And the soldiers go into battle in a formation called phalanx. And this is where they line up in rows and interlock their shields, with the front row of the soldiers pointing their spear out at the enemy over the shield. And as mentioned, some of these spears were 21 feet long, making it near impossible for the enemy to break through. So as we mentioned, these hoplites were decked in bronze armour, covering the body, and a bronze helmet on their head and a bronze shield. Their sword and spear tip were typically made of bronze or iron. And I find the shield interesting because it's typically 1 metre wide and it weighs 6 to 8 kilos. But it was curved so that part of it would support the shoulder. It was made of 3 layers. It had a thick wooden layer in the middle, and it was bronze on the outside and leather on the inside. And the phalanx formation reached its pinnacle under Alexander the Great. And you can imagine on the battlefield during this period seeing a wall of bronze shields and helmets slowly marching towards you. It would be like seeing a wave of bronze approaching, rippling over the landscape. And indeed, it was a wave of bronze, wasn't it? Slowly expanding, as we said, all the way from Greece down to Egypt and across to India. But the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC marked the start of the decline of the empire. When he died, there was no natural successor to the throne, so Alexander's generals battled it out for power. And eventually, when things settled, Alexander's empire had been split into 3. The Ptolemaic kingdom based in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire based in the Middle and Far East, and the Antigonid dynasty in the north. But within 50 years of the death of Alexander the Great, the Greco-Roman Wars began. And by 146 BC, only 177 years after Alexander the Great died, Greek independence ended as they were absorbed into the Roman Empire. And so this then brings us to the legs of iron. Unlike the second and third kingdoms, this one gets a longer description by Daniel. In verse 40 it actually says, "Then there shall be a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron, just as all things are broken to pieces and shattered by iron, so it will shatter and crush everything." And this kingdom is, of course, the Roman Empire. And looking at it on a modern day map, we see this empire at its peak stretched from England in the north, south to the northern coast of Morocco, east to Egypt, up through Israel, Syria, and then back west through Turkey, Greece, Italy, and France. And at this peak, in roughly 117 AD, it controlled every coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Coming back to our chapter, though, again, take a moment to think. Could Daniel know that Rome was going to defeat Greece 400 years before it happened? Daniel, as we said, wrote this book in the mid-600 BC, 400 years before 146 BC, when the Greek Empire was absorbed into the Roman Empire. And again, it's interesting to think Rome during Daniel's time was only 50 to 100 years old. It was then being ruled by Namapompilus, only the second ruler after Romulus. And I say kingdom, but actually at this time Rome was no more than a city, little more than 4 by 4 kilometres squared. Could Daniel have known that one day the city would become a nation large enough to destroy Greece? Daniel, as we said, maybe didn't even know that Greece was going to become an empire. No, Daniel obviously by himself would have no idea what was going to happen 400 years into the future. But God does know, doesn't he? God knows the beginning from the end. God knew what was going to happen 400 years later, and he told Daniel. And this is how we have full confidence in the fact that God knows what is in store for our future and the future of this planet that we live on. And God has indeed told us what this future would be. Back in our chapter, though, let's again ask, why does God use iron to represent Rome? Well, unlike the other metals, we are actually told directly by Daniel in verse 4. Rome was represented by iron because it will shatter and crush everything. And indeed, iron was the strongest metal known to man at the time. And it was the metal of choice for the Romans. And it is, of course, what we use to make steel today. Warfare was at the heart of the Roman Empire. And in fact, conflict in Roman culture goes right back to the origins of Rome and the legendary battle between Romulus and Remus. War was a source of prestige in Roman culture. And Edward Gibbon writes in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the terror of the Roman arms added weight and dignity to the moderation of the emperors. They preserved peace by a constant preparation for war. And there's another great quote in the article called Roman Warfare in the World History Encyclopedia. And it says, Rome was more or less in a continuous state of war or readiness for it. And Rome believed absolutely in the necessity of defending and imposing on others what she firmly believed was her cultural superiority. So the Romans not only had warfare at their heart, but they were also excellent at it, crushing the enemy time and time again. They were well organised, well equipped, and well supplied. And this is why in 240 years, from 220 BC to 20 AD, it grew from the size of Italy today to controlling areas of Italy, Greece, France, Spain, Portugal, half of Turkey, Egypt, and much of the coast of the Mediterranean. It then, as we mentioned, grew to even larger, hitting its peak in AD 117. It crushed all its enemies, and this is why it is represented by iron. However, Roman size and its rapid growth due to its strength became its major weakness. After the assassination of Emperor Alexander Severus in 235 AD, the empire sank into 50 years of civil war. The barbarian tribes in the north took advantage of this and increased their invasions. And the problem that Rome had is that getting messages of invasions and uprisings from wherever it's happening to Rome, and then getting a response back from Rome back to where the uprising is happening, was becoming a big task because of the sheer size of the empire. Controlling such a large territory was impractical, so the decision was made to split it. And Diocletian in 286 AD introduced a system where two senior emperors titled Augustus would rule under Caesar, one in the east and one in the west. And this is why we have two legs of iron. The people of Rome considered the empire to be one, but in reality they were two. And this split really marked the slow collapse of the empire. Within 200 years, the Western Empire had essentially collapsed, and the Eastern Empire survived for a long period. Actually, they survived and they collapsed in 1453. By this time, they were the Byzantine Empire. And so the Roman Empire falls, and we come to the bottom of the image. We come to the feet and toes of iron and clay. And again, we get a lot of detail here from Daniel, and let's just look at some of these details. So firstly, he mentioned feet and toes, and I found that sort of interesting because previously Daniel wasn't as detailed, was he? He didn't mention, for example, hands and fingers, or nose and eyes and mouth. But here Daniel mentions the toes, doesn't he? And Daniel, I think, is just pointing out how divided this period of time would be. And then again, the next thing, Daniel specifically mentions in verse 41 that it will be divided. And Daniel mentions that it will be partly strong and partly broken. And Daniel mentions that they will mix together, but they won't stick together, again emphasising the division. And so we ask the question, what do the feet represent? What empire do the feet represent? And the answer is none. The feet do not represent any single empire, and that is the point, isn't it? Since the fall of Rome, there has never been a nation to have ruled as much of Europe as they did. There is, in fact, 1 year where Germany had a good crack at it, and we have the map on the screen. Can anyone tell me when this map maybe is from? What year? Surely some people know. 1942, yes. 1942 this map is from, in World War II. However, as we know, 4 years later from this map, Europe looked like this, didn't it? It had divided into many nations. If we zoom a bit closer to our time, we see Europe even more divided. And we have this map here. Anyone tell me what this map is? What year? No, not. Did I miss one? No, that's the right one. Yeah. Well, this, I guess it probably hasn't changed a huge amount, but this was actually from 1992. So this was after the collapse of the USSR. And so you can probably try count the nations if you wanted to, but where the Roman Empire once stood, there are now 20 plus countries. And when we think of our time, we don't have to look hard to see divisions in Europe, do we? And just two major examples are Britain's exit from the EU a number of years ago. It was a shock to the world, wasn't it? One of the founding members of the EU leave the organisation. And it really showed the weakening of European ties. And the other major example of division in Europe is obviously the attack on Ukraine. And this again was a bit of a wake-up call, wasn't it? It was a wake-up call for Europe. And it really also, to me at least, showed the lack of power that NATO has in being able to help Ukraine. And they can obviously send weapons to Ukraine, but NATO has said themselves that they would never send troops to Ukraine, because that would obviously bring NATO in direct conflict with Russia. And to me, this sort of begs the question, does this then give Russia free rein to attack any country outside of NATO? Because NATO doesn't want to send troops, because they don't obviously want a war with Russia. So looking back at our chapter, then we see Daniel has told us that as well as clay, the feet actually contains iron. And iron, as we mentioned before, was of course the metal which the legs were made of, which represented Rome. So what Daniel was saying is that despite there being no Roman Empire, Rome will live on within the divided Europe. And we can easily see this manifested in the influence and the strength of the Roman Catholic Church, which has 1.3 billion members worldwide, which is nearly a fifth of the world's population, and roughly 35% of Europeans are Catholics. And Forbes magazine in 2018, so slightly outdated, but they listed Pope Francis as the sixth most powerful person. So 1 to 4 were Xi Jinping, Putin, Trump, Angela Merkel, and then fifth was Jeff Bezos, who's the Amazon founder, and then the Pope was number 6. And there are actually some things that I find odd about the Pope's influence that I didn't actually realise before. And I learnt this reading the transcript of a podcast by the Council on Foreign Relations. And there was a discussion between these three people. So there was Gabriella, who was just the interviewing journalist, and there was Timothy Bynes, who is a professor of political science and economics at Colgate University, and he's also the author of 4 books about the Catholic Church's role in politics. And there was Francis Campbell, who is the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Notre Dame in Australia, not in France. It's apparently in Perth. Anyway, some of the things mentioned really surprised me, so I'm just going to mention 2 of them, share 2 of them with you. So at the moment, the Pope has diplomatic relations with 183 countries, including the US. And what this means is that the Pope has access to international relations like no other religious leader of our day. For perspective, the US has diplomatic relations with 188 countries, only 5 more than the Pope. So the Pope has a direct line of contact to 183 countries, a direct line of communication to the presidents, prime ministers, or whoever is ruling those 183 countries. And the other thing I found interesting on top of this is that the Pope is a permanent observer at the UN and is invited to participate in UN conferences and conventions. And this is unlike any other religious leader, isn't it? You can't imagine the universal leader of the Salvation Army or someone being invited to participate in UN conferences. It's just something that doesn't happen to anyone, any religious leader, apart from the Pope. And so this really shows the influence of the Catholic Church in Europe today. And so these feet, they represent a divided Europe and the Roman Catholic Church's influence over it. And this then brings us to the stone, the final part of our prophecy. And Daniel actually tells us exactly what the stone represents. Daniel 2 verse 44, Daniel says, "And in the days of those kings," so those kings that Daniel is referring to as the rulers of the many nations that make up the divided feet. So in the days of those kings, at the time of the feet, let's say, "the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever." So just like the other transitions through the image between nations, there shall be one final transition. This divided world shall be overthrown by the final kingdom, the kingdom of God. And it's clear to see here that this kingdom differs from the other kingdoms of Nebuchadnezzar's image. And it differs in 2 ways. So firstly, it is a kingdom that will last forever. As it says in verse 44, it won't be destroyed and won't be passed on to anyone else. And secondly, it's going to cover the whole earth. And we can see this in verse 35. It says, "The stone that struck the image became a mountain and filled the whole earth." And this is again unlike any other kingdom, isn't it? How long did the others last? Maybe 1,000 years? This kingdom is going to last forever, which is a time that we can't even fathom, isn't it? And it's going to cover the whole earth. The Roman and Greek empires, they were obviously very big, but nowhere near covering the entire earth, were they? This kingdom is going to cover the whole of the globe. Before concluding tonight, I think there's a few details that are interesting to note about this final section. The first one is that the stone was cut without hands, and this symbolises the fact that this final kingdom is not one made or ruled by humans. All other kingdoms are ruled and developed by humans, weren't they? And interestingly, they were obviously also destroyed by humans. Enemy armies, enemy rulers came and overthrew kingdoms. This kingdom will be different. It would be ruled by Jesus and God. The second thing to note is that the stone represents Jesus, Jesus coming back to the earth. And Jesus, in Luke 20, verse 17 to 18, talks about himself. He says, "What is this then that is written? The stone which the builders rejected, the same has become the head of the corner. Whosoever shall fall upon that stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder." And you can hear the references to this prophecy, can't you? And so the stone flying in and crashing into the feet of the image represents Jesus' return to the earth. Mark 13, verse 26 describes the time saying, "And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and with glory." And this brings us to the third thing to note, which is the dual purpose of the stone. Peter in 1 Peter 2, verse 6 to 8 picks up on this, and he speaks of Christ as the head cornerstone, but also as a stone of stumbling. And this alludes to the fact that when Jesus returns to the earth, he will both pull down all rule and authority and judge the living and the dead, but the other purpose of his return will also be to glorify his saints, and he will make the righteous to shine, and he will provide everlasting life to the believers. So as we sort of draw to a conclusion tonight, let's just take a moment again to think and to remember the accuracy of what has been written by Daniel here. Daniel, as we said, he lived in 605 BC. During this period, the Greek cities were only just starting to form relationships. During this period, Rome was a city only slightly larger than the Adelaide CBD. Yet despite this, Daniel wrote this amazing prophecy which foretold the fall of Babylon to the Medo-Persians, then the fall of the Persians to the Greeks, which wasn't going to happen for another 200 years. Then the fall of the Greeks to the Romans, which wouldn't happen for another 400 years. And then he foretold the fall of the Roman Empire. Daniel was only able to write these details because God provided him with the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. How amazing is that? It's absolutely amazing, and it's why we can be 100% certain that the rock will strike the image and that Jesus will return to set up the kingdom. That's the only part of the image that is not yet fulfilled. As Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar in verse 45, the great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain and the interpretation is sure. God has made known to us what will happen in the future, potentially even within our lifetime. And God has shown to us in the Bible, and God has shown to us this prophecy and recorded his next steps in the Bible, and the interpretation we know is sure. And so it's now up to us to respond to Jesus. It's now up to us to decide if Christ will be a stumbling block or a precious stone to us when he returns.
Well, thanks, Jimmy, for taking us through that incredible chapter, showing us those 2,000 years of prophecy that have so accurately been prophesied and also fulfilled, and then that stone which we're waiting for it to come just now, and that we all want to be a part of that kingdom that is coming. So, as Jimmy mentioned at the start of the lecture there, this is a 3-part series. Next week, we're going to be taking a look at Ezekiel 38, which is another very exciting prophecy about things that are to come to pass very soon. So we look forward to that next week. There's also some supper. We'd love you to hang around for that as well. But before we share that together, we'll just say, we'll close our night with a prayer if you just want to stand. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you once again for the time that we've been able to share together. We thank you for this amazing prophecy in Daniel 2 that we've been able to look at tonight. We thank you that you revealed all of these things that were to come to pass to Daniel, and that you left them on record for us, that they might be a witness to us, that they might strengthen our faith, and that they also might show us what is going to happen in our futures as well, hopefully very shortly. We thank you for the supper that you've provided for us now, and pray that you be with us as we return to our homes tonight as well. And it's in your Son's name we approach you now. Amen.